Moscow, late 1945. The Kremlin is shrouded in shadows. Joseph Stalin, the man who had just crushed the Third Reich, stands alone in his office, staring at a top-secret NKVD file. His generals wait in the hallway, sensing a tension that hasn't been felt since the darkest days of 1941. Stalin wasn't worried about the atomic bomb or political treaties. He was obsessed with one name: George Patton. While the rest of the world saw a hero, Stalin saw a predator who didn't know how to stop. According to declassified Soviet records, Stalin turned to Marshal Zhukov and issued a chilling warning that history tried to bury. He said, "The Americans have a madman in their ranks who wants to finish what Hitler started. And if we don't stop Patton now, we will be fighting him in the streets of Moscow." This is the untold story of Stalin's obsession with the only American general he truly feared, and the terrifying words he spoke before Patton's mysterious end. To understand Stalin's fear, you must first understand the absolute contempt he held for the Western Allies. To Stalin, war was a brutal numbers game played in the mud and blood of the Eastern Front. He looked at the British and Americans and saw merchants in uniforms. He famously mocked them as Coca-Cola soldiers, men who required hot turkey dinners, chocolate bars, and total air superiority just to move a few miles. He believed that the capitalist world was too soft for the kind of total annihilation he practiced every day. He once told his inner circle that the Americans were great at making cars, but terrible at making martyrs. But then, the intelligence reports from Sicily and North Africa began to change. A name started appearing in every NKVD summary: George S. Patton. Stalin read about a general who didn't wait for air cover, who ignored the safety of his flanks, and who drove his men until they collapsed from exhaustion. Patton wasn't fighting a polite Western war. He was moving with a savage, relentless tempo that mirrored the Soviet Union's own deep battle doctrine. Stalin watched as Patton's 7th Army swallowed Sicily in weeks, outperforming every British unit on the island. He realized that this wasn't a merchant. This was a throwback to the great conquerors of old. Stalin reportedly leaned over a map in the Kremlin, pointed at Patton's position, and whispered to Molotov, "This American in the ivory-handled pistols does not fight for profit. He fights for the kill. He is the first Westerner I have seen who understands that speed is more valuable than life." For the first time, the Kremlin realized that the Americans had produced a shark in a pool of minnows. As the summer of 1944 approached, Stalin's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He was a man who lived by deception, and he was terrified of being deceived himself. Yet George Patton managed to do exactly that. Stalin fell completely for the Allied ruse of the 1st U.S. Army Group. He sat in Moscow, analyzing reports of inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, convinced that Patton was the iron fist that would strike Pas-de-Calais. Stalin's respect for Patton was so great that he refused to believe the Americans would leave their best general on the sidelines. He told his intelligence chiefs, "Eisenhower is a politician, but Patton is a soldier. They will not start the real war without him." When the real invasion hit Normandy and Patton finally unleashed the Third Army, Stalin's fascination turned into a cold, calculated dread. He watched as Patton broke out at Avranches and began a sprint across France that made the German blitzkrieg look slow. Stalin's staff officers were stunned. They had never seen a Western army move 400 miles in 3 weeks. But Stalin saw something else. He saw a man who was racing not just against the Germans, but against the Soviet Union. He knew that if Patton's tanks crossed the Rhine and reached Berlin first, The Soviet dream of a communist empire in Europe would be shattered before it could begin. Stalin began asking for hourly updates on Patton's fuel supplies. He privately hoped the Allied logistics would fail where the Wehrmacht had not. He issued a standing order to the GRU. If Patton reaches the Elbe, I want to know exactly what color his eyes are. He is no longer a partner in this war. He is the primary obstacle to our future. The mask of the Grand Alliance finally disintegrated in the lavish, smoke-filled banquet halls of occupied Bavaria in August 1945. The war was over, but for George Patton, the real enemy had just revealed itself. Patton, a man who spoke his mind with the force of an artillery shell, made no secret of his loathing for the Soviet delegation. He treated the Russian generals with the same icy contempt he had shown the defeated Nazis. He famously refused to drink a toast with a Soviet officer, stating he didn't drink with sons of bitches. When the NKVD reported this back to the Kremlin, the atmosphere in Stalin's office turned lethal. Stalin didn't just see a rude general, he saw a clear military threat. He received transcripts of Patton's private conversations where the general was lobbying high-ranking officials to keep the boots on and drive the Red Army back to the borders of 1939. Patton was suggesting something unthinkable, rearming the defeated German Wehrmacht to join the Americans in a crusade against the Soviet Union. Stalin sat at his desk, staring at the reports of Patton's popularity with his troops. He knew that the Soviet people were exhausted, their country in ruins, while Patton's army was fresh, lethal, and fueled by a commander who wanted to march on Moscow. Stalin turned to Lavrenti Beria, the terrifying head of the secret police, and said, "Patton is the only man with the will to actually do it. The others are politicians who want to go home. He is a wolf who has tasted blood and wants more. Find the weakness. Find the opening." By the autumn of 1945, George Patton was a man marked for death. Stalin understood the American political landscape better than almost anyone in the West. He knew that the American public was tired of war, but he also knew they worshipped heroes. In Stalin's mind, a living George Patton was a ticking time bomb. He called a late-night meeting of the Politburo, the air thick with the smell of his tobacco and the fear of his subordinates. Valentin Bereshkov, Stalin's personal interpreter, recalled the chilling tone of the leader's voice. Stalin argued that Patton was not just a military threat, but an ideological one. Stalin said, "If this man returns to America, he will become a king. He will tell the truth about what we are doing in Poland and Berlin. He will demand a war that we are not yet ready to fight. As long as he breathes, our Iron Curtain is made of glass." Stalin looked at Beria and the generals of the Smersh units and issued a directive that was never meant to be written down. Dead heroes are used for monuments and school books. Living heroes change history. Patton is talking too loudly, and he is far too close to our borders. We cannot afford his return to Washington. From that moment on, every movement Patton made was tracked by a shadow network of Soviet agents embedded in the American occupation zone. The Patton problem was no longer a matter of diplomacy. It was a matter of survival for the Soviet Empire. In December 1945, the execution was finally carried out. George Patton died following a suspicious low-speed car accident in Mannheim, a collision with a military truck that should have been a minor incident. While the world mourned a fallen hero, a very different scene was playing out in Moscow. Stalin was hosting a private dinner at his dacha when the news of Patton's death arrived. He didn't erupt in joy. He simply stopped eating, looked at the men around the table, and raised a glass of heavy Georgian wine. He spoke in a low, satisfied tone. The Americans have done our work for us. They have cut off the head of their own tiger. Now, we can sleep in peace. The only man who could have destroyed our future is gone. With Patton silenced, the last significant voice of resistance to Soviet expansion was removed. Within 2 years, the Iron Curtain was locked tight, and the Cold War began in earnest. For decades, the coincidence of Patton's death has been debated. Was it a freak accident, or was it Stalin's most successful wet work operation of the post-war era? What we know for certain is that Stalin feared George Patton more than any other man in the West. He feared his speed, his aggression, and most of all, his honesty. In the end, Stalin's assessment was correct. Without Patton, the road to Soviet domination was open. Let me know what you think in the comments. Was this a Kremlin hit? Or did the world just lose its greatest warrior to a twist of fate?
This was Mike. Stay sharp and never forget that history is written in the shadows.